Welcome, gentle dreamer, to the sacred archives where ancient wings still whisper through corridors of memory and the songs of forgotten islands echo in chambers carved from starlight and devotion. Tonight we shall journey through the luminous chronicle of Mothra, the divine protector whose wings have carried prayers across oceans of time, from her first awakening in tropical paradise to her eternal dance between destruction and rebirth. Let the rhythm of ancient melodies carry you into peaceful slumber as we walk together through realms where goddesses take flight and the sacred bond between earth and sky remains unbroken through all the ages of the world. In the beginning of legends, when the world still remembered the songs that had been sung before the first human voice had learned to speak, there existed a place where time moved according to rhythms older than civilization itself, where the boundary between the sacred and the mortal remained as thin as morning mist over volcanic slopes. This was Infant Island, a jewel of emerald jungle and coral beaches set like a prayer in the endless blue of the Pacific, where the very stones held memories of creation and the wind carried whispers of divine purpose through groves that had never known the sound of axes or the scars of human ambition. The island itself was born from the marriage of fire and water, thrust upward from the ocean depths by volcanic forces that had shaped continents and carved the foundations of the world during ages when no eye existed to witness such magnificent violence. Its soil was rich with minerals that had been refined by geological processes spanning millions of years, creating conditions that could nurture life forms of extraordinary beauty and power, while its isolation had protected it from the contamination and exploitation that had corrupted so many other places where humanity had established its dominion. The indigenous people, who had found their way to this paradise across trackless waters in canoes carved from sacred trees, had recognized immediately that they stood upon ground that belonged not to them, but to forces that transcended human understanding and demanded respect rather than conquest. Their ancestors had come bearing nothing more than hope and the wisdom to recognize divinity when they encountered it, establishing settlements that worked in harmony with the natural rhythms of their new home, rather than attempting to impose alien patterns upon landscapes that had achieved perfection through millions of years of undisturbed development. These islanders, who would eventually be known to the outside world as the people of Infant Island, had built their civilization upon principles that prioritized spiritual understanding over material accumulation, developing technologies that enhanced rather than replaced the natural processes that sustained all life upon their tropical refuge. Their buildings were constructed from materials that the island provided freely, designed to complement rather than dominate the contours of the land, while their social structures reflected the harmony they observed in the relationships between all living things that shared their domain. At the heart of their spiritual understanding lay the recognition that their island home was not merely a place of residence, but a sacred trust that they held on behalf of forces whose power and wisdom exceeded anything that human intelligence could fully comprehend. They understood that they were not rulers of their environment, but participants in a complex web of relationships that connected every grain of sand to every star in the night sky, every drop of rain to every breath drawn by every creature that called the island home. The manifestation of this divine presence had revealed itself to them in forms that spoke directly to their understanding of the sacred, appearing first as luminous beings whose size belied their infinite capacity for wisdom and compassion. These were the Shobijin, the twin fairies whose existence bridged the gap between the mortal world and realms of pure spirit, serving as messengers and interpreters for communications that flowed between the human inhabitants of the island and the goddess whose protection made their peaceful existence possible. The Shobijin appeared to human eyes as tiny women of perfect beauty, their forms delicate as flower petals, yet possessed of strength that could move mountains, when channeled through proper spiritual preparation and absolute devotion to the welfare of all living things. Their voices carried harmonies that human ears recognized as the fundamental music underlying all creation, melodies that could soothe the most savage beast or call down the very elements themselves when circumstances required divine intervention in mortal affairs. These divine messengers communicated through songs that transcended the limitations of ordinary language, employing combinations of sounds and rhythms that spoke directly to the soul, rather than requiring translation through the intellectual processes that govern normal human communication. The melodies they sang were not merely beautiful but functionally sacred, carrying within their structure the very codes that governed the relationship between the spiritual and physical realms, enabling those who understood their meaning to participate consciously in the cosmic harmonies that maintained universal order. The most sacred of these compositions was the song that would eventually become known to the wider world as the Mothra song, a melody of such profound spiritual significance that its performance could summon the goddess herself from whatever realm she inhabited during periods when her direct presence was not required for the protection of her worshippers. This song had been taught to the islanders by the Shobijin themselves during the earliest days of human settlement, when the establishment of proper spiritual protocols was essential for ensuring that the delicate balance between divine power and mortal needs would be maintained across all future generations. The lyrics of this sacred composition were crafted in languages that predated the development of conventional human speech, incorporating elements that scholars would later identify as belonging to Indonesian linguistic traditions, but modified through generations of spiritual refinement to achieve harmonic combinations that produce specific resonances in both human consciousness and the natural world. Each syllable had been chosen not merely for its meaning in conventional terms, but for its capacity to generate vibrations that aligned the singer's spiritual essence with the fundamental frequencies that governed the operation of divine power in mortal realms. The performance of this song required not only technical mastery of its complex melodic and rhythmic structures, but also spiritual preparation that involved purification rituals, meditative practices, and the cultivation of absolute devotion to the welfare of all living creatures, rather than the advancement of personal desires or tribal ambitions. Those who sang it without proper preparation might produce beautiful sounds that pleased human ears, but would fail to establish the connection with divine power. That was the song's ultimate purpose and justification. When performed correctly by voices that had been prepared through years of spiritual discipline and selfless service to the community, the Mothra song served as an invocation that could traverse the boundaries between visible and invisible worlds, calling upon the goddess to manifest her presence in whatever form circumstances required for the protection of her faithful servants and the preservation of the sacred balance that maintained peace and prosperity throughout their island. Paradise. The goddess who responded to these invocations was known to her worshippers simply as Mothra, a being whose true nature encompassed both the terrible power necessary to destroy any force that threatened her domain, and the infinite compassion that sought always to preserve and nurture life in all its magnificent variety. Her relationship with the islanders was not that of a distant deity who demanded worship in exchange for occasional favors, but rather that of a loving mother whose protection extended to every aspect of their existence, from the success of their crops, to the safety of their children, to the preservation of their culture, against influences that might corrupt or destroy their spiritual traditions. Mothra's physical manifestations took forms that reflected both her divine nature and the practical requirements of whatever challenges her people faced, appearing sometimes as a massive larva whose slow but inexorable movement could reshape landscapes and clear obstacles that blocked the path to safety. sometimes as a magnificent winged adult whose flight could carry her across oceans, or whose presence could intimidate enemies whose power seemed overwhelming when measured by merely human standards. In her larval form, Mothra embodied the patient strength of Earth itself, moving with the deliberate pace of geological processes that could carve canyons through solid rock or raise mountains from ocean floors through the accumulation of countless small actions performed with unwavering determination across vast spans of time. Her bulk was supported by hundreds of legs that distributed her weight so evenly that she could cross terrain that would collapse beneath lesser creatures, while her mandibles possessed the strength to clear forests or excavate channels through solid stone, when circumstances required the reshaping of the physical world to serve spiritual purposes. Yet, even in this seemingly primitive form, Mothra demonstrated intelligence that exceeded human understanding, making decisions that considered not only immediate, tactical requirements, but also long-term consequences for the ecological and spiritual balance that sustained all life within her sphere of influence. Her actions were guided by wisdom that encompassed both the scientific understanding of natural processes and the spiritual insight that recognized the sacred connections linking all aspects of creation within unified systems of mutual support and interdependence. The transformation from larva to adult form represented not merely biological metamorphosis, but spiritual evolution that symbolized the potential for growth and transcendence that existed within all living beings when they aligned themselves with divine purposes, rather than limiting their ambitions to the satisfaction of immediate material desires. The chrysalis stage that bridged these forms served as a period of sacred preparation during which the physical restructuring of Mothra's body was accompanied by spiritual refinements that prepared her for the expanded responsibilities that came with her winged incarnation. As an adult, Mothra achieved dimensions that dwarfed the largest creatures known to human experience. Her wingspan, reaching across distances that could shelter entire cities beneath the protective shadow of her flight, while her presence in the sky served as a visible reminder that divine power remained active in the world and available to those who maintained proper spiritual relationships with the forces that governed the universe according to principles of justice, compassion, and respect for the sacred nature of all life. Her wings were not merely organs of flight, but instruments of power that could generate winds capable of dispersing the largest storms or clearing the air of pollutants that threatened the health of those under her protection. The patterns that decorated these wings carried symbolic significance that spoke to those who possessed the spiritual sensitivity to interpret their meaning, revealing prophecies about future events or guidance about proper responses to challenges that faced her worshippers in their daily lives. The scales that covered Mothra's wings possessed properties that transcended ordinary matter, capable of producing effects that seemed miraculous to observers who lacked understanding of the spiritual principles that made such phenomena possible. When released into the air, these scales could create atmospheric conditions that promoted healing, encouraged plant growth, or provided protection against harmful influences, while their luminous quality filled the night sky with patterns of light that served both practical and spiritual purposes for those who witnessed their display. Mothra's eyes blazed within a fire that reflected her divine nature, capable of perceiving not only physical objects but also the spiritual essences that animated all living things, allowing her to distinguish between those whose intentions were pure and those whose hearts harbored corruption or malice toward the innocent. This supernatural perception made her an infallible judge of character, whose protection extended automatically to all who deserved it, while providing no sanctuary for those who would exploit or harm others for personal gain. Her voice, when she chose to use it, produced sounds that ranged from melodic calls that could soothe frightened children to roars that could shatter mountains when divine wrath needed to be expressed in terms that even the most arrogant mortals could not ignore or misinterpret. The songs that she sang echoed the melodies taught by the Shobijin, creating harmonies that linked earth to heaven and reminding all who heard them of the fundamental unity that connected every aspect of creation within systems of mutual support and shared destiny. The relationship between Mothra and her twin fairy messengers represented a perfect example of divine cooperation, with each aspect of the goddess's nature fulfilling functions that complemented rather than competed with the others, creating a unified system of protection that could respond appropriately to any threat regardless of its scale or nature. While the Shobijin maintained direct communication with human worshippers and provided guidance about proper spiritual practices, Mothra herself served as the active force that implemented divine will in situations that required intervention on scales beyond human capability. This division of responsibilities ensured that every level of existence within Infant Island's spiritual ecosystem received appropriate attention and protection, from the smallest insect whose role in pollination was essential for plant reproduction to the largest trees whose root systems prevented erosion that might undermine the island's geological stability. No aspect of life was too insignificant to merit divine concern, while no challenge was too overwhelming to exceed the scope of divine power when properly invoked through sincere prayer and righteous action. The islanders, who served as intermediaries between these divine forces and the broader community of living beings, had developed sophisticated understanding of the protocols and procedures that governed proper interaction with spiritual powers, maintaining traditions that ensured each generation would possess the knowledge necessary to preserve their sacred relationships across whatever challenges the future might bring to their isolated paradise. These human guardians of divine wisdom included priests whose training encompassed both practical knowledge about island ecology and theoretical understanding of spiritual principles, teachers who preserved the songs and stories that maintained cultural continuity, and craftspeople whose work produced the physical objects required for proper religious ceremonies and daily life activities that honored the sacred nature of all creative endeavors. The children of the island grew up immersed in educational experiences that taught them to recognize the divine presence in every aspect of their environment, from the morning light that awakened the flowers to the evening breezes that carried the fragrance of tropical blooms across villages where families gathered to share food and stories beneath stars that served as constant reminders of the full, cosmic scope within which their small lives possessed infinite significance when aligned with purposes greater than individual survival or comfort. The agricultural practices developed by these people reflected their understanding that the island itself was a living entity whose health and fertility required respectful treatment rather than exploitative extraction of resources without regard for regeneration or long-term sustainability. Their crops were grown using techniques that enhanced rather than depleted soil quality, while their harvesting practices ensured that plant communities would continue to thrive across generations, rather than being damaged by short-sighted pursuit of immediate abundance at the expense of future productivity. The animals of Infant Island had also developed unique relationships with both the human inhabitants and the divine forces that protected their shared environment, displaying behaviors that suggested levels of intelligence and cooperation that exceeded anything documented among similar species. In other locations where human presence had disrupted natural patterns through competition rather than collaboration, birds served as messengers carrying information across distances that would challenge human communication systems, while marine creatures provided transportation and assistance that enabled the islanders to maintain contact with other communities scattered across the vast Pacific Ocean. The coral reefs that surrounded the island formed protective barriers against both physical threats and spiritual contamination, their living structures serving as filters that prevented harmful influences from reaching the sacred spaces where divine power was concentrated and channeled for the benefit of all life within the island's sphere of influence. These reefs were tended by human guardians whose responsibilities included monitoring their health and performing rituals that maintained the spiritual connections, linking underwater ecosystems to terrestrial environments through systems of energy exchange that operated according to principles unknown to conventional scientific understanding. The volcanic activity that had originally created the island continued to provide geothermal energy that supported both practical applications and spiritual practices, with natural hot springs serving as sites for purification rituals, while underground heat sources enabled the cultivation of plants whose growth requirements could not have been met through solar energy alone. The islanders understood that this continuing geological activity represented the ongoing creative power of divine forces, requiring respectful acknowledgement rather than fearful avoidance of processes that could reshape their world according to divine purposes that transcended human planning or control. The weather patterns that affected Infant Island were influenced by spiritual as well as meteorological factors, with the island's divine protection extending to atmospheric conditions that could either enhance or threaten the welfare of its inhabitants, depending upon the spiritual state of the community and the degree to which their actions aligned with divine will as expressed through natural law and moral principles. Storms that might devastate other locations often transformed into gentle rains that nourished crops and replenished fresh water supplies, while periods of calm provided opportunities for spiritual reflection and cultural activities that strengthened the bonds connecting all members of the island community. The artistic traditions that flourished within this protected environment reflected the spiritual insights that came from living in direct contact with divine power, producing music, visual arts, and literary works that captured aspects of spiritual truth in forms accessible to human understanding, while pointing toward realities that exceeded the capacity of any single artistic medium to encompass completely. These creative expressions served both aesthetic and educational functions, preserving cultural knowledge while inspiring new generations to maintain the spiritual practices that made their peaceful existence possible. As the wider world began to develop technologies and social systems that prioritized material advancement over spiritual wisdom, the isolation that had protected Infant Island from external corruption became increasingly difficult to maintain, with radio transmissions and atmospheric nuclear testing introducing influences that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance between divine power and human community that had sustained the islanders' way of life for countless generations. The arrival of outside explorers and commercial interests represented challenges that would test both the islanders' commitment to their spiritual traditions and Mothra's power to protect her people against forms of exploitation and destruction that exceeded anything their ancestors had ever encountered during their long history of peaceful coexistence with divine forces that demanded respect rather than worship, cooperation rather than submission, and wisdom rather than blind obedience to authority that lacked spiritual legitimacy or moral justification. In the year 1964, when the world stood poised between the fading echoes of one era and the dawning possibilities of another, the creative forces that had given birth to the atomic age's most magnificent monsters reached the pinnacle of their artistic and technical mastery, producing a work that would forever stand as the supreme achievement of the golden age of kaiju cinema. This was the year when two of Japan's most beloved creatures would meet in combat that transcended mere spectacle to become a meditation on the eternal struggle between destruction and creation, between the forces that sought to exploit the natural world and those that rose to defend it against corruption and annihilation. The collision between Godzilla and Mothra that unfolded across the screens of Japanese theaters during the spring of 1964 represented far more than a simple monster battle designed to thrill audiences seeking escape from the complexities of modern life. It was a carefully crafted artistic statement that brought together the finest talents in the Japanese film industry at the moment, when their individual skills had been refined to perfection through years of collaboration on projects that had pushed the boundaries of what cinema could achieve. Through the marriage of practical craftsmanship and visionary imagination, director Ishiro Honda approached this project with the accumulated wisdom of more than a decade spent exploring the mythic possibilities inherent in stories about creatures whose existence challenged every assumption about humanity's relationship with forces that operated according to principles older than civilization itself. His vision for Mothra versus Godzilla was shaped by his understanding that these monsters served as vessels for expressing truths about the human condition that could not be communicated through conventional dramatic techniques, requiring the kind of symbolic language that only fantasy cinema could provide with sufficient power and clarity. The screenplay crafted by Shinichi Sekizawa wove together themes that had been developing throughout the early years of the kaiju genre, bringing them to fruition in a narrative that balanced spectacular action with philosophical depth, creating a work that could satisfy audiences seeking pure entertainment while rewarding more contemplative viewers with layers of meaning that revealed themselves through repeated examination and reflection. The technical achievements that would make this film legendary began with the creation of the Mosugoji Godzilla suit, a masterpiece of practical effects artistry that represented the culmination of everything that had been learned about the challenges of bringing giant monsters to life through the dedication and skill of human performers working within elaborate constructions that transform their bodies into vessels for expressing primal forces that dwarf individual identity. Haruo Nakajima, the man whose movements would give life to Godzilla throughout the golden age of kaiju cinema, found in the Mosugoji suit a perfect balance between functionality and artistic expression, with the lighter weight and improved mobility allowing him to imbue his performance with subtle nuances that had been impossible to achieve in earlier, more cumbersome versions of the costume. The suit's facial features, characterized by prominent brows and an expression of perpetual anger, created a visual representation of barely contained fury that communicated Godzilla's essential nature as a force of atomic vengeance without requiring dialogue or exposition. The construction of this suit involved innovations in materials and techniques that pushed the boundaries of what costume makers had previously believed possible, with special attention paid to the distribution of weight and the placement of cooling systems that would allow the performer to work for extended periods without succumbing to the physical demands that had limited earlier productions. Every detail, from the texture of the scales to the articulation of the fingers, was refined through countless hours of experimentation and testing, creating a costume that would become the standard against which all future Godzilla suits would be measured. Parallel to these developments in creature design, the technical team led by Eiji Tsuburaya was revolutionizing the art of special effects cinematography through the acquisition and mastery of equipment that had previously been available only to the largest Hollywood studios. The optical printer that Tsuburaya had observed during his visits to American facilities represented a quantum leap in the sophistication of effects that could be achieved through post-production manipulation of imagery allowing for composites and superimpositions that had been impossible using earlier techniques. The Oxberry optical printer that became the centerpiece of Tsuburaya's expanded arsenal of tools enabled effects artists to combine up to 5 separate image elements into seamless composites, reducing the reliance on hand-painted mats and time-consuming traditional techniques, while opening up new possibilities for visual storytelling that had never before been attempted in Japanese cinema. This technological advancement was particularly crucial for the sequences involving the Shobijin, whose interactions with full-sized human actors required precise integration of miniature performances with conventional cinematography. The creation of Mothra herself for this film involved pushing the art of marionette construction to levels of sophistication that would not be surpassed for decades, with the full-grown moth form requiring a complex system of cables, counterweights, and remote controls that could simulate the natural movements of flight while supporting the massive structure needed to create the illusion of a creature whose wingspan exceeded that of modern aircraft. The delicate beauty of Mothra's wings, created from fabrics specially selected for their ability to catch and reflect light in patterns that suggested the luminous quality associated with divine beings, contrasted dramatically with the reptilian bulk of her opponent, creating a visual metaphor for the conflict between grace and brutality that lay at the heart of the film's thematic concerns. The larval form of Mothra presented different but equally challenging technical requirements, with the decision to create twin larvae, adding complexity to sequences that already pushed the limits of what practical effects could achieve. The construction of these creatures involved innovative approaches to creating the impression of organic movement through mechanical means, with internal systems that could simulate the undulating motion of segmented bodies while supporting performers who would bring personality and intelligence to beings that might otherwise have appeared as mere mechanical constructs. The underwater sequences that featured these larval forms required the development of specialized equipment and techniques for filming in aquatic environments, with waterproofing and underwater lighting systems that could maintain the illusion of giant creatures moving through natural marine habitats while protecting expensive costumes and equipment from the corrosive effects of prolonged exposure to water and chemicals used in studio tank facilities. The miniature sets constructed for this production represented the pinnacle of model-making artistry, with unprecedented attention to detail that was necessitated by the film's production in color, requiring levels of realism that had been unnecessary during the era of black and white photography. The recreation of Nagoya and its surrounding industrial complexes involved months of research and construction, with each building and landmark reproduced with sufficient accuracy to satisfy viewers familiar with the actual locations, while providing appropriate scales for interaction with the giant creatures that would destroy them. The famous Nagoya Castle sequence, which would become one of the most memorable moments in kaiju cinema history, required the construction of multiple versions of the historic structure, each designed to serve specific functions within the sequence while maintaining consistency of appearance and proportions. The careful planning that went into the destruction of this model, including the calculation of structural weak points and the timing of collapse mechanisms, demonstrated the level of engineering expertise that had become necessary for creating convincing destruction sequences in an era when audiences had become increasingly sophisticated in their expectations for realistic special effects. The petroleum refinery complex that served as the setting for Godzilla's initial rampage was recreated with meticulous attention to industrial detail, incorporating functional lighting systems and practical fire effects that could create the impression of genuine catastrophic damage while maintaining safety standards that protected both performers and equipment. The explosion sequences that punctuated this destruction required careful coordination between pyrotechnics, specialists, and camera operators, with multiple camera positions capturing different aspects of each blast, to provide editors with sufficient coverage to create the illusion of massive industrial accidents. The human drama that provided the emotional foundation for these spectacular effects sequences was anchored by performances from actors who understood their responsibility to maintain dramatic credibility even when surrounded by the fantastic elements that defined kaiju cinema. Akira Takarada, returning to the genre that had helped establish his career, brought to his role as newspaper reporter Ichiro Sakai the combination of sincerity and intelligence that made him believable as someone who could navigate the bizarre circumstances that surrounded encounters with giant monsters while maintaining the ethical standards expected of a journalist in a democratic society. Yuriko Hoshi's portrayal of photographer Junko provided the film with a strong female perspective that complemented rather than competed with the divine femininity represented by Mothra herself, creating layers of meaning about the role of women in both protecting and documenting the world around them. Her character's evolution from professional observer to active participant in the struggle to protect Mothra's offspring demonstrated the way extraordinary circumstances could reveal heroic potential that might otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary daily existence. The villains of the piece, portrayed with theatrical excess that bordered on caricature, yet remained grounded in recognizable human motivations, served as representatives of the corporate mentality that viewed natural resources as commodities to be exploited rather than treasures to be preserved. Their schemes to profit from Mothra's egg reflected real-world patterns of environmental exploitation that audiences could recognize from their own experience, giving weight to conflicts that might otherwise have seemed purely fantastical. The government officials and scientific experts who populated the supporting cast brought credibility to exposition sequences that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of their own absurdity, with performances that treated the fantastic elements of the story as genuine scientific and political challenges requiring rational responses based on available evidence and established procedures. Their debates about appropriate responses to the crisis reflected real discussions that were taking place in Japanese society about the role of technology in modern life and the responsibilities that came with the power to reshape the power to reshape the power. Natural world. The Shobijin themselves, portrayed by the musical duo known as the Peanuts, brought to their performances a combination of otherworldly beauty and profound sadness that perfectly captured their role as messengers from a realm where spiritual values took precedence over material concerns. Their songs, composed with the same attention to mythic resonance that characterized the film's visual elements, served as both plot devices and artistic statements about the power of music to transcend cultural barriers and communicate truths that ordinary language could not express. The recording of these musical sequences required innovations in sound design that paralleled the advances being made in visual effects, with multi-track recording techniques that could layer harmonies and instrumental accompaniments to create aural landscapes that suggested the supernatural origins of the Shobijin's power. The integration of these songs into the film's overall sound design required careful balance between the naturalistic audio that accompanied dramatic sequences and the stylized musical passages that elevated certain moments into the papa realm of pure poetry. Akira Ifukube's musical score for the film represented another pinnacle of achievement in a career devoted to finding the perfect sonic expression for stories that transcended ordinary human experience. His themes for both Godzilla and Mothra had evolved through previous films to the point where they had achieved the status of musical archetypes, instantly recognizable melodies that could evoke specific emotions and associations in audiences who had followed the development of these characters across multiple productions. The battle sequences that formed the climactic centerpiece of the film required unprecedented coordination between all elements of the production, with choreography that had been planned in advance to ensure that every movement served both spectacular and narrative purposes. The contrast between Godzilla's raw physical power and Mothra's more subtle abilities created opportunities for visual storytelling that communicated character and theme through action rather than dialogue, with each exchange of attacks revealing new aspects of the fundamental conflict between destruction and protection that drove the story forward. The death of adult Mothra, portrayed with a combination of practical effects and performance art that transformed what might have been merely another monster battle into a genuine tragedy, demonstrated the emotional power that could be achieved when technical excellence served a clear artistic vision. The maternal sacrifice that preserved her offspring while apparently ending her own existence provided the film with its most powerful moment of genuine pathos, elevating the entire production beyond mere entertainment into the realm of authentic art. The hatching sequence that followed transformed despair into hope through special effects techniques that combined practical puppetry with animated elements, creating the impression of new life emerging from apparent defeat in ways that suggested the cyclical nature of existence and the possibility of renewal, even in the face of overwhelming destruction. The twin larvae that emerged from their mother's egg carried with them both the physical capabilities needed to challenge Godzilla and the spiritual significance required to transform their victory into something more meaningful than mere revenge. The final battle between the larval Mothra twins and Godzilla pushed the boundaries of practical effects, artistry to their absolute limits, with sequences that required perfect coordination between performers, puppeteers, and technical crew to maintain the illusion of organic interaction between creatures of vastly different scales and types of construction. The silk that ultimately defeated the atomic monster was created using innovative materials and application techniques that could produce the visual impression of organic webbing while remaining safe for the human performer trapped within its embrace. The underwater sequences that concluded the film required the development of specialized filming techniques for aquatic environments, with underwater cameras and lighting systems that could capture the majesty of Mothra's victory while maintaining the practical requirements for protecting expensive costumes and equipment from water damage. The image of Godzilla sinking beneath the waves, wrapped in silk that glowed with reflected sunlight, provided a visual metaphor for the triumph of natural harmony over atomic chaos that resonated with audiences who had lived through the nuclear age and understood the symbolic significance of such imagery. The production's attention to scientific accuracy, evident in details ranging from the geological processes that created the typhoon opening to the behavioral patterns exhibited by the giant creatures during their confrontations, demonstrated respect for audience intelligence that had become characteristic of the best kaiju films. Even within a framework of pure fantasy, the filmmakers maintained internal consistency and logical development that allowed viewers to accept the extraordinary events on screen as genuine possibilities within the world that had been created for their entertainment and edification. The environmental themes that permeated every aspect of the production reflected growing awareness of ecological issues that would become central to political and cultural discourse in later decades, with the exploitation of Mothra's egg serving as a metaphor for humanity's relationship with natural resources that required protection rather than consumption. The corporate villains who sought to profit from divine power represented attitudes toward the natural world that the film clearly identified as both morally wrong and ultimately self-destructive. The international elements woven throughout the story, from the isolated island setting to the global implications of atomic testing, reflected Japan's position as a nation that had experienced the devastating effects of nuclear weapons, while maintaining cultural traditions that emphasized harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them. The film's message about the need for cooperation between different cultures and approaches to understanding the world resonated with audiences who were witnessing the emergence of Japan as a major economic power with responsibilities that extended beyond its own borders. The technical innovations pioneered during the production of Mothra vs. Godzilla would influence special effects cinema for decades to come, with techniques and approaches that were developed to solve the specific challenges of this production, finding applications in countless subsequent films, both within and beyond the kaiju genre. The optical printing methods that enabled seamless integration of miniature and full-scale elements became standard tools for effects artists worldwide, while the approaches to creature design and performance established templates that continued to influence monster movies well into the digital era. The cultural impact of the film extended far beyond its immediate commercial success, with images and themes that became permanent fixtures in the collective imagination of audiences who had experienced the unique combination of spectacle and meaning that characterized the golden age of Japanese monster cinema. The sight of Mothra's luminous wings spreading across the sky became an iconic representation of divine protection, while Godzilla's atomic breath served as a continuing reminder of the destructive potential that lay within humanity's technological achievements. The film's exploration of the relationship between traditional spiritual values and modern technological capabilities provided a framework for understanding conflicts that would continue to shape human civilization long after the BNets. Specific political and social circumstances that inspired the original production had passed into history. The tension between exploitation and preservation, between individual profit and collective welfare, between immediate gratification and long-term responsibility, remained as relevant to future generations as they had been to the audiences who first witnessed the epic confrontation between Atomic Destroyer and Divine Protector in the spring of 1964. In the years that followed Mothra's triumphant sacrifice against the Atomic Destroyer, when the goddess had proven that divine love could indeed overcome humanity's greatest mistake, through the combined power of maternal devotion and evolutionary wisdom, the world itself began to change in ways that would transform the very nature of the conflicts that had defined the early age of giant monsters. The emergence of threats that exceeded even Godzilla's terrible power would require new forms of cooperation between forces that had previously viewed each other as irreconcilable enemies, creating alliances that transcended the simple categories of good and evil that had governed earlier encounters. The arrival of King Ghidorah in 1964 marked the beginning of a new era in which the monsters of Earth would be forced to recognize that their local conflicts paled in significance before cosmic threats that sought not merely to destroy human civilization but to eradicate all life from the planet entirely. This three-headed dragon from the depths of space represented a form of malevolence that was alien in the truest sense, operating according to principles of destruction that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of an appetite for chaos that could never be sated through any conceivable victory or conquest. Mothra's response to this unprecedented crisis revealed new dimensions of her divine nature that had remained hidden during her previous appearances. As she emerged from whatever realm she inhabited between manifestations to serve not merely as protector of her human worshippers, but as mediator between Earth's titans in their first great alliance against forces that threatened their shared world. Her role in convincing Godzilla and Rodan to set aside their territorial disputes and join her in defense of the planet demonstrated wisdom that transcended species, boundaries, and tactical understanding that encompassed both the immediate requirements of the battle and the long-term implications of establishing precedents for cooperation between beings whose power could reshape continents. The communication between these massive creatures revealed complexities of monster psychology that had never before been explored in such depth, as Mothra's ability to speak the ancient languages that all Titans understood provided audiences with their first glimpse into social dynamics that operated on scales and according to principles that dwarfed human political systems. Her patient explanations to Godzilla about the necessity of protecting the planet that provided them all with homes and hunting grounds demonstrated that her intelligence encompassed not only spiritual wisdom, but also practical understanding of ecological relationships that connected all living things within systems of mutual dependence. The philosophical debates that preceded their alliance, conducted in roars and gestures that conveyed meanings far more complex than human language could express, revealed that these creatures possessed individual personalities and motivations that influenced their decisions in ways that paralleled but exceeded human reasoning processes. Godzilla's initial reluctance to join forces with beings he had previously viewed as competitors for dominance reflected the same territorial instincts that had driven his earlier conflicts, while his eventual agreement to cooperate demonstrated capacity for growth and adaptation that suggested intelligence that continued to evolve through experience. Rodan's participation in these discussions revealed aspects of aerial predator psychology that had remained mysterious during his solo appearances, as his perspective from the skies provided unique insights into global patterns of threat and opportunity that ground-based creatures could not perceive with equal clarity. His reconnaissance abilities proved crucial for developing tactical approaches to combating an enemy whose 3 heads could coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, while maintaining aerial superiority that neutralized many conventional defensive strategies. The battle strategies that emerged from these inter-Titan consultations demonstrated levels of sophisticated planning that exceeded anything that human military organizations had achieved in their campaigns against individual monsters, with each participant contributing capabilities that complemented rather than duplicated those of their allies. Mothra's powers of flight and her ability to generate hurricane-force winds provided tactical mobility and environmental manipulation that could create opportunities for her earthbound partners to exploit, while her scales properties offered both offensive capabilities and protective effects that could shield her allies from attacks that might otherwise prove devastating. Godzilla's atomic breath, when coordinated with Mothra's aerial maneuvers, created combination attacks that were far more effective than either creature could achieve individually, while his massive physical strength provided the foundation for defensive formations that could withstand Ghidorah's lightning attacks long enough for counterstrikes to be organized and executed. The sight of the Atomic King, serving as anchor for tactical formations, directed by the Queen of Monsters, represented a revolution in Kaiju combat doctrine that would influence all subsequent multi-monster encounters. Rodan's mastery of aerial combat provided the Alliance with capabilities that matched Ghidorah's natural advantages in 3-dimensional battle spaces, while his sonic abilities created opportunities for disrupting the coordination between the space dragon's multiple heads that was essential for its most devastating combination attacks. The complex aerial choreography that developed as these flying titans maneuvered for position above battlefields that stretched across entire regions demonstrated that monster warfare had evolved far beyond the simple rampages that had characterized earlier encounters. The victory that these Earth Titans achieved over their cosmic enemy established precedents for cooperation that would influence their relationships with each other and with humanity for decades to come, as the experience of fighting together against a common threat created bonds that transcended the territorial imperatives that had previously governed their interactions. Mothra's role as the architect of this alliance elevated her status from regional protector goddess to planetary guardian, whose influence extended to creatures and communities far beyond the boundaries of her traditional sphere of influence. The aftermath of the Ghidorah battle saw the establishment of Monster Island, a concept that represented humanity's attempt to create a managed solution to the challenges posed by sharing the planet with beings whose size and power made coexistence problematic under conventional circumstances. This artificial paradise, designed to provide suitable habitats for creatures whose needs exceeded anything that natural environments could offer, became both sanctuary and prison for monsters, whose presence in populated areas had proven incompatible with human civilization's requirements for predictability and safety. Mothra's relationship with this new arrangement reflected her unique position as the only monster whose motivations aligned consistently with human welfare, making her simultaneously the most trusted and the most independent of the Titans who found themselves subjects of humanity's evolving monster management policies. Her ability to come and go as she pleased, based on the respect she had earned through her protective actions, rather than the fear that kept other creatures confined, demonstrated that cooperation based on mutual understanding remained possible even within frameworks designed primarily for control and containment. The Monster Island community that developed over the following years provided unprecedented opportunities for observing inter-Titan social dynamics under conditions that approximated natural coexistence while maintaining sufficient human oversight to prevent conflicts that might threaten global stability. The relationships that evolved between creatures who had previously encountered each other only as competitors or enemies revealed complexities of monster psychology that challenged every assumption about the intelligence and emotional capabilities of beings whose size had led many observers to dismiss them as mere forces of nature rather than individuals with personalities and preferences. Mothra's role within this community combined the functions of diplomatic mediator, spiritual counselor, and protective elder sister to creatures who struggled to adapt to circumstances that differed radically from the conditions under which they had originally evolved or been created. Her patient guidance of Godzilla's gradual transition from destroyer to protector reflected understanding of behavioral modification techniques that operated on emotional and spiritual levels rather than relying solely on conditioning through rewards and punishments. The festivals and celebrations that developed within Monster Island's artificial ecosystem provided visitors with opportunities to observe creatures whose public images had been shaped entirely by their most destructive actions, displaying gentler aspects of their personalities that had remained hidden during their rampages across human civilization. The sight of Godzilla playing with Manila, his adopted son, while Mothra watched benevolently from nearby perches, demonstrated that even the most fearsome titans possessed capacity for family relationships and emotional bonds that transcended simple territorial or survival instincts. The educational programs that emerged from scientific observation of these monster communities provided humanity with insights into biological and psychological principles that operated on scales far beyond anything that conventional research had previously been able to investigate, with implications that extended from individual development to ecosystem management to interspecies communication techniques that might prove applicable to future encounters with alien intelligence. Mothra's willingness to participate in these research projects combined with her ability to serve as interpreter for creatures whose communication methods remained mysterious to human observers, made her an invaluable bridge between species whose differences might otherwise have prevented meaningful understanding. The environmental restoration projects that became possible through cooperation with Monster Island's inhabitants demonstrated practical applications for Titangent scale capabilities that had previously been viewed primarily as threats to human security and economic stability. Mothra's ability to revitalize damaged ecosystems through the careful application of her scale's regenerative properties provided solutions to ecological problems that had seemed insoluble using conventional technology, while her knowledge of plant and animal relationships enabled the development of restoration strategies that operated according to natural principles rather than forcing artificial solutions upon complex environmental systems. The agricultural innovations that emerged from studying Mothra's interactions with plant communities opened new possibilities for sustainable farming techniques that could feed expanding human populations without depleting soil, resources, or requiring chemical inputs that damaged surrounding ecosystems. Her ability to enhance crop yields through controlled application of her powers, combined with her knowledge of natural pest control methods that maintained beneficial insect populations while eliminating destructive species, provided frameworks for developing farming systems that worked in harmony with natural processes rather than attempting to replace them with artificial alternatives. The medical applications discovered through analysis of Mothra's scales and silk revealed therapeutic properties that exceeded anything that conventional pharmaceutical research had achieved, with compounds that could accelerate healing processes, reduce inflammation, and stimulate immune system responses in ways that enhanced the body's natural recovery mechanisms, rather than masking symptoms or creating dependency on continued treatment. The ethical questions raised by these discoveries reflected broader issues about the relationship between human medical needs and monster welfare that required careful consideration of consent and compensation for creatures whose cooperation made such advances possible. The communication breakthroughs that resulted from decades of interaction between Mothra and human researchers provided the foundation for developing translation protocols that enabled meaningful dialogue with other titans whose intelligence had previously been accessible only through observation of their actions, rather than direct exchange of ideas and information. The complex gestural and sonic languages that monsters used among themselves revealed philosophical concepts and emotional nuances that challenged human assumptions about the relationship between intelligence and physical form. The space exploration projects that became feasible through cooperation with creatures whose capabilities exceeded anything that human technology could achieve opened possibilities for investigating cosmic threats before they reached Earth's vicinity, with Mothra's flight abilities and radiation resistance making her an ideal reconnaissance specialist for missions that would have been impossible using conventional spacecraft. Her reports from high-altitude and low-orbital surveys provided early warning systems for detecting approaching dangers that might otherwise have achieved surprise attacks similar to Ghidorah's original assault. The disaster response capabilities that developed through integration of monster abilities with human organizational systems revolutionized emergency management for natural catastrophes that had previously overwhelmed conventional response resources, with Mothra's ability to locate survivors in devastated areas and her capacity for clearing debris from transportation routes, enabling rescue operations on scales that had never before been possible. Her coordination with human emergency services during earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions demonstrated that cooperation between species could achieve results that neither could accomplish independently. The climate modification experiments that became possible through careful application of monster-scale environmental manipulation abilities provided humanity with new tools for addressing atmospheric changes that threatened global stability. With Mothra's wind generation capabilities and her understanding of atmospheric dynamics, enabling interventions that could influence weather patterns without creating unintended consequences that might prove more dangerous than the problems they were intended to solve. The educational initiatives that brought human children into direct contact with Monster Island's inhabitants under carefully controlled conditions produced generations of young people whose understanding of interspecies relationships was shaped by personal experience with beings whose intelligence and emotional complexity challenged traditional categories for thinking about the relationship between humanity and the natural world. Mothra's special rapport with young visitors reflected her maternal instincts and her recognition that future coexistence would depend upon attitudes and assumptions that were established during childhood rather than modified through adult education programs. The artistic collaborations that emerged from cultural exchange between human creative communities and monsters, whose aesthetic sensibilities had been shaped by entirely different evolutionary and environmental influences, produced works that expanded the boundaries of artistic expression beyond anything that either species could have achieved independently. Mothra's contributions to these projects reflected understanding of beauty and harmony that operated according to principles that human artists could learn from, without fully comprehending the cosmic perspectives that informed her aesthetic judgments. The philosophical discussions that developed between human scholars and monsters whose lifespans and experiences encompassed perspectives that transcended individual human existence provided new frameworks for understanding questions about consciousness, identity, mortality, and purpose that had challenged thinkers throughout human history, without reaching satisfactory resolution through purely human intellectual resources. Mothra's insights into the cyclical nature of existence, informed by her personal experience of death and rebirth, offered perspectives on continuity and change that helped human philosophers develop more comprehensive approaches to questions that had previously seemed unanswerable. The spiritual movements that grew from recognition of monsters as divine or semi-divine beings whose presence in the world carried religious significance reflected humanity's ongoing struggle to find meaning and purpose in a puppasy universe whose scale and complexity exceeded the capacity of traditional belief systems to encompass completely. Mothra's role within these movements reflected both her historical connection to human religious practices and her demonstrated capacity for inspiring the kind of awe and devotion that characterized genuine spiritual experience rather than mere intellectual acceptance of abstract theological concepts. The technological innovations that resulted from studying monster biology and behavior provided solutions to engineering problems that had limited human technological development for centuries, with applications ranging from materials science to energy generation to transportation systems that could operate according to principles derived from observation of creatures whose capabilities exceeded anything that conventional physics had previously explained satisfactorily. Mothra's flight mechanisms and her ability to generate and manipulate various forms of energy provided templates for developing technologies that operated in harmony with natural forces rather than attempting to overcome them through brute force applications of power. As the decades passed and the initial wonder of monster coexistence gave way to routine acceptance of their presence in human society, Mothra's continuing role as mediator and protector ensured that the relationships between species continued to evolve in directions that served the welfare of all participants, rather than merely accommodating the convenience of the most powerful or numerous groups. Her wisdom and patience provided stability during periods of tension or misunderstanding, while her demonstrated commitment to justice and compassion served as a model for behavior that both humans and monsters could aspire to emulate in their own interactions with others whose needs and perspectives differed from their own. The legacy of cooperation that emerged from these years of gradual integration provided foundations for addressing challenges that would require unprecedented coordination between all Earth's intelligent species, as threats from space, environmental degradation, and technological developments that exceeded the control of any single group created situations where survival itself depended upon the ability to work together despite differences that had once seemed insurmountable. In the decades that followed, the establishment of Monster Island and the delicate equilibrium that had emerged between humanity and the titans who shared their world. The passage of time brought with it changes that would transform not only the specific creatures who had become symbols of humanity's relationship with forces beyond their control, but also the very nature of how such stories could be told to audiences whose understanding of environmental and why technological issues had evolved far beyond what earlier generations had possessed when they first witnessed the emergence of giant monsters from the depths of atomic nightmares. The 1990s marked the beginning of what would become known as the Heisei Renaissance, a period of creative renewal that saw the resurrection of beloved characters and concepts within frameworks that reflected both advances in filmmaking technology and deeper understanding of the ecological and spiritual themes that had always formed the philosophical foundation of the greatest kaiju cinema. This renaissance would prove particularly significant for Mothra, whose role as divine protector and maternal guardian would be explored with unprecedented depth and complexity through a trilogy of films that elevated her from supporting character to the central figure in stories that addressed contemporary environmental concerns with urgency that previous generations had not yet been prepared to confront. The first of these new interpretations emerged in 1996 with Rebirth of Mothra, a film that established a fresh mythology while maintaining reverence for the spiritual traditions that had defined the character since her original appearance 3 decades earlier. This new version of Mothra's story acknowledged the accumulated weight of environmental destruction that had occurred during the intervening years, presenting audiences with a world where the consequences of industrial civilization's disregard for natural harmony had reached critical thresholds that required intervention by forces whose power transcended merely human capabilities. The Elias, who served as Mothra's representatives in this reimagined continuity, reflected evolution in how divine messengers might appear to modern audiences who had grown sophisticated in their understanding of mythology and symbolism, while simultaneously becoming more desperate for genuine, spiritual guidance in addressing problems that seemed to exceed human wisdom or technological solutions. Mole and Laura, the twin fairies who replaced the original Shobijin, brought to their roles depths of characterization that allowed them to serve as fully realized individuals rather than merely symbolic representations of otherworldly wisdom. The relationship between these fairy guardians and the children who would become their human allies demonstrated recognition that environmental protection required the kind of innocent courage and uncorrupted moral clarity that adults, compromised by participation in systems that created the very problems requiring solution, might no longer possess in sufficient measure to motivate the dramatic changes that genuine sustainability would demand. The young protagonists of these new Mothra stories carried with them both the energy necessary for challenging established patterns of behavior and the emotional openness required for forming authentic connections with beings whose nature transcended ordinary human categories. The introduction of Batra as Mothra's dark counterpart represented one of the most sophisticated explorations of moral complexity that the kaiju genre had yet attempted, presenting audiences with a creature whose motivations were fundamentally sound, yet whose methods threatened to destroy the very civilizations that his actions were intended to protect. This dark moth embodied the harsh justice of natural forces that had been pushed beyond their capacity for patient tolerance of human interference, representing Earth's immune system, responding to civilization as if it were a disease requiring elimination, rather than a community requiring guidance toward healthier relationships with the ecosystems that sustained all life. The conflict between Mothra and Batra that formed the emotional core of their shared story reflected debates that were occurring throughout human society about the appropriate responses to environmental crises that had reached scales and urgency that demanded immediate action, while simultaneously requiring careful consideration of approaches that would address root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Mothra's insistence upon protecting humanity, despite their destructive behaviors, demonstrated the kind of unconditional love that characterized true maternal devotion, while Batra's determination to eliminate human influence entirely reflected the logical conclusion of purely rational analysis that failed to account for the potential for growth and redemption that remained present even within the most damaged relationships. The resolution of this conflict through sacrifice and mutual understanding provided audiences with frameworks for approaching similar dilemmas in their own lives and communities, suggesting that apparent contradictions between justice and mercy, between preservation and transformation, between individual needs and collective welfare, might be resolved through approaches that transcended the either-or thinking that had created many of the problems requiring solution. The death and resurrection cycles that characterize both Moth stories reinforced themes about the possibility of genuine renewal that required letting go of patterns and identities that had outlived their usefulness, while preserving essential values that remained valid across all circumstances. The technological innovations that made these new Mothra films possible reflected advances in special effects artistry that had occurred during the years since the original golden age of kaiju cinema, with computer-generated imagery beginning to supplement traditional practical effects techniques in ways that expanded the range of visual possibilities while maintaining the tactile quality that had made earlier monster movies so compelling to audiences who craved authentic physical presence, rather than purely digital fantasies. The integration of these technologies required careful balance between innovation and tradition, ensuring that new capabilities enhanced, rather than replaced, the craftsmanship that had made the originals classics. The environmental destruction depicted in these films achieved levels of realism and emotional impact that earlier productions had been unable to accomplish with the more limited resources available during the Showa era, creating images of ecological devastation that resonated with audiences who had witnessed similar destruction in their own communities and regions. The sight of ancient forests being clear-cut for short-term commercial profit, of rivers and lakes poisoned by industrial waste, of atmospheric pollution, creating health crises that affected children and elderly populations most severely, provided context for monster battles that transformed them from simple entertainment into urgent calls for action on issues that affected every viewer's daily life. The corporate villains who drove much of the conflict in these updated stories represented evolution in how business antagonists were portrayed, moving beyond simple greed to encompass systematic approaches to environmental exploitation that operated according to institutional logics that individual participants might not even recognize as destructive. These more sophisticated portrayals of corporate malfeasance reflected growing understanding of how environmental damage occurred, not primarily through individual evil, but through organizational structures that rewarded short-term thinking and penalized consideration of long-term consequences that fell outside immediate profit calculations. The Mothra Leo, who emerged during the latter films of the trilogy, represented unprecedented exploration of gender dynamics within Kaiju mythology, as the traditionally feminine protective goddess gave birth to offspring, whose masculine energy could be channeled toward more aggressive forms of environmental protection that complemented, rather than replaced, maternal nurturing approaches. This evolution of Mothra's mythological significance reflected broader cultural conversations about the roles that different aspects of human nature might play in addressing crises that required both gentle healing and forceful defense against forces that refused to respond to purely peaceful approaches. The time travel elements that became prominent in Rebirth of Mothra 3 demonstrated how environmental concerns could be understood as spanning temporal scales that exceeded individual human lifespans, connecting contemporary decisions to consequences that would affect future generations while also linking present problems to historical choices that had created unsustainable patterns of resource consumption and waste production. The prehistoric settings that featured prominently in these sequences provided audiences with visions of what Earth had been like before industrial civilization had begun reshaping natural systems according to purely human priorities, creating nostalgic longing for harmony that might still be achievable through appropriate changes in behavior and values. The rainbow Mothra form that represented the ultimate evolution of the protective goddess incorporated visual symbolism that spoke to audiences familiar with both traditional rainbow imagery as divine covenant and contemporary understanding of how light could be separated into component colors that each contributed essential qualities to the complete spectrum. This transformation sequence demonstrated that growth and development could enhance rather than replace essential characteristics, with Mothra's evolved form possessing new capabilities, while maintaining the compassionate nature that had defined her relationship with humanity throughout all her previous incarnations. The children who served as protagonists throughout these films represented different aspects of environmental consciousness that would be necessary for building sustainable relationships with natural systems, from scientific curiosity that sought to understand ecological principles to emotional empathy that recognized the inherent value of all living things to practical determination that translated understanding and feeling into effective action. Their cooperation with each other and with the adult allies who supported their efforts provided models for the kind of intergenerational collaboration that would be essential for addressing environmental problems whose solutions required both immediate action and long-term commitment spanning decades or centuries. The fairy kingdoms and mystical realms that provided settings for crucial sequences in these films offered audiences glimpses of alternative ways of organizing society that prioritized harmony with natural forces over domination, environmental resources, suggesting that technological capabilities could be developed and applied according to principles very different from those that had shaped industrial civilization's approach to manipulating the physical world. These utopian visions served not as escapist fantasies, but as inspiration for approaches to community development that might be adapted to contemporary circumstances through appropriate modifications. The musical elements that continued to play central roles in these updated Mothra stories reflected both continuity with traditional themes and evolution toward more complex harmonic structures that could address emotional and spiritual needs of audiences whose musical sophistication had been shaped by exposure to global cultural traditions rather than purely national or regional influences. The new arrangements of classic melodies demonstrated how timeless themes could be refreshed without losing their essential power to communicate across generational and cultural boundaries. The international settings that featured prominently in several of these films acknowledged that environmental problems had become global in scope requiring cooperation between nations and cultures that had historically viewed each other as competitors rather than partners in addressing shared challenges. The portrayal of different countries and regions emphasized both unique local characteristics that deserved preservation and universal human values that could provide foundations for collaborative efforts to protect planetary ecosystems from destruction that recognized no political boundaries. The scientific explanations that were integrated into these stories reflected advances in ecological understanding that had occurred during the decades since the original Mothra films had been produced, incorporating concepts from systems theory, climate science, and conservation biology that provided audiences with educational content alongside entertainment value. These educational elements were woven into dramatic narratives in ways that enhanced rather than interrupted story flow, demonstrating that learning and enjoyment could be combined effectively when both objectives were pursued with appropriate skill and commitment. The government responses depicted in these films showed evolution in how official institutions approached environmental crises, moving beyond simple denial or ineffective bureaucratic procedures toward more sophisticated understanding of problems that required unprecedented coordination between agencies and departments whose traditional responsibilities had not prepared them for challenges that transcended conventional administrative categories. The portrayal of officials who struggled to develop appropriate responses to unprecedented threats provided audiences with more nuanced understanding of how institutional change might occur under pressure from problems that could not be solved using existing approaches. The military applications of monster abilities that were explored in some of these films reflected contemporary debates about appropriate uses of advanced technologies, with questions about whether powerful capabilities should be deployed for defensive purposes only, or whether proactive interventions might sometimes be necessary to prevent greater harm from occurring through inaction. The ethical dilemmas that arose from these considerations provided audiences with opportunities to think through complex moral questions that had no simple answers, but required careful consideration of competing values and priorities. The healing sequences that became prominent features of later films in the trilogy demonstrated how destruction could be reversed through appropriate application of natural regenerative processes, providing hope for communities that had experienced environmental damage, while also illustrating the kind of patient, careful work that genuine restoration would require. These sequences avoided easy solutions or magical transformations, instead showing how healing occurred gradually through sustained effort that addressed underlying causes rather than merely treating visible symptoms. The sacrifice themes that culminated these stories maintained continuity with traditional mythological patterns, while adapting them to contemporary contexts, where individual heroism might be less important than collective action that required many people making smaller contributions rather than single individuals providing dramatic gestures. The deaths and rebirths that punctuated these narratives reinforced messages about renewal being possible, while acknowledging that meaningful change often required letting go of familiar patterns and identities that had become obstacles to necessary growth. The legacy themes that connected these films to their predecessors, while establishing foundations for future stories, demonstrated how cultural traditions could evolve without losing their essential power to inspire and guide human behavior toward more sustainable and compassionate relationships with the natural world and with each other. The respect shown for earlier interpretations of Mothra's story while developing new possibilities for her continuing evolution provided models for how contemporary environmental movements could learn from historical conservation efforts while adapting to changed circumstances that required new approaches and strategies. The visual spectacle that these films achieved through combination of traditional craftsmanship and emerging digital technologies created experiences that satisfied audiences' desires for entertainment value while delivering educational and inspirational content that could influence behavior and attitudes in ways that purely didactic approaches might not accomplish as effectively. The balance between spectacular action sequences and quieter character development scenes demonstrated that environmental themes could be explored through multiple dramatic modes that appealed to different audience preferences and learning styles. As the 20th century drew toward its close and humanity stood upon the threshold of a new millennium that promised both unprecedented technological capabilities and environmental challenges that would test every assumption about civilization's relationship with the natural world. The kaiju genre itself underwent transformations that reflected both the maturation of filmmaking techniques and the evolution of cultural consciousness regarding humanity's place within ecological systems that had grown increasingly fragile under the pressures of industrial expansion and resource exploitation that recognized no boundaries save those imposed by immediate profitability. The year 2001 marked a pivotal moment in this ongoing evolution when director Shusuke Kaneko, whose previous work had demonstrated mastery of both spectacular visual storytelling and profound thematic depth, undertook the creation of Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah Giant Monster's all-out attack, a film that would challenge every conventional assumption about the moral universe that these creatures inhabited while simultaneously pushing the boundaries of what practical effects artistry could achieve in an era when computer-generated imagery was beginning to reshape audience expectations about the nature of cinematic reality. Kaneko's interpretation of Mothra within this radically reconceptualized mythology represented one of the most sophisticated explorations of spiritual themes that the kaiju genre had yet attempted, transforming the benevolent goddess from a protector of humanity into something far more complex and morally challenging. In this reimagined continuity, Mothra emerged not as the maternal figure who had traditionally shielded human civilization from the consequences of their actions, but as a guardian spirit of Japan itself, awakened from ancient slumber to participate in a cosmic judgment that would determine whether the nation that had forgotten its spiritual heritage deserved to survive the reckoning that their collective amnesia had invited upon them. The philosophical framework that governed this new interpretation of monster mythology drew upon deep currents of Japanese spiritual tradition that had been largely absent from earlier kaiju films, incorporating concepts from Shinto belief systems that recognized the spiritual essence inhabiting natural phenomena, while simultaneously addressing contemporary concerns about cultural memory and national identity that had become increasingly urgent as Japan's economic prosperity had been accompanied by what many observers viewed as spiritual impoverishment and disconnection from traditional values. The Godzilla that Mothra would face in this cosmic trial represented not the familiar atomic metaphor of previous incarnations, but something far more terrible and personally threatening to Japanese audiences who had grown comfortable with viewing the monster as a protective force rather than an agent of divine retribution. This new Godzilla embodied the vengeful spirits of all those who had died in Pacific War conflicts, their souls twisted by decades of official denial and cultural amnesia into a composite entity whose hunger for recognition and justice had transformed into pure destructive rage that could only be satisfied through the complete obliteration of the society that had forgotten their sacrifices. Mothra's role as one of three guardian spirits chosen to defend Japan against this supernatural threat positioned her within a mythological framework that emphasized collective rather than individual responsibility, with her willingness to sacrifice herself in defense of a nation that had abandoned the spiritual practices that had originally earned divine protection, representing the kind of unconditional love that transcended human concepts of deserved versus undeserved mercy. Her participation in this spiritual warfare acknowledged that some battles could not be won through physical force alone, but required the kind of moral transformation that could only be achieved through genuine recognition of past mistakes and commitment to better choices in future generations. The visual representation of this spiritualized Mothra incorporated design elements that emphasized her connection to traditional Japanese aesthetic principles, while simultaneously utilizing the most advanced practical effects techniques available at the time, creating a creature whose presence on screen carried both the weight of ancient mythology and the immediacy of contemporary cinematic spectacle. The delicate beauty of her wing patterns and the ethereal quality of her movements spoke to audiences who had been raised on images of technological power and urban sophistication, reminding them of natural harmonies and spiritual realities that their modernized society had systematically excluded from daily consciousness. The battle sequences that featured this reimagined Mothra pushed the boundaries of practical effects artistry to unprecedented levels of sophistication, with wire work and puppetry techniques that created the impression of truly supernatural movement patterns that transcended ordinary physical limitations while maintaining the tactile authenticity that distinguished the greatest kaiju films from purely digital alternatives. The integration of computer-generated enhancement elements with traditional craftsmanship demonstrated how new technologies could serve artistic visions that remained grounded in respect for the manual skills and creative dedication that had established the genre's reputation for spectacular yet emotionally resonant entertainment. The sacrifice that concluded Mothra's participation in this cosmic drama represented one of the most powerfully emotional moments in the entire history of kaiju cinema, as her death provided the spiritual energy necessary for her fellow guardian monsters to achieve victory over forces that could not be defeated through purely material means. The visual poetry of her final moments, with particles of her essence ascending toward heaven, while her physical form dissolved into light that blessed her surviving allies, created imagery that spoke to universal human experiences of loss and transcendence, while remaining specific to the cultural and spiritual contexts that gave the story its particular emotional weight. The aftermath of this battle established precedents for understanding monster conflicts as spiritual rather than merely physical confrontations, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate narrative to encompass broader questions about the relationship between traditional values and modern lifestyles, between individual desires and collective responsibilities, between technological capabilities and wisdom about their appropriate applications. The Japan that emerged from this trial bore the scars of genuine transformation rather than simple restoration, acknowledging that some forms of damage could only be healed through acceptance of changed circumstances rather than attempts to return to conditions that had been irretrievably altered by the passage of time and the accumulation of irreversible choices. The critical and commercial success of this radically reimagined approach to kaiju mythology opened possibilities for further explorations of themes that had previously been considered too complex or culturally specific for international audiences, demonstrating that sophisticated treatment of spiritual and philosophical questions could enhance rather than diminish the popular appeal of monster movies, when such content was integrated skillfully into narratives that maintained the spectacular visual elements that define the genre's core entertainment value. The techniques developed for bringing this spiritualized version of Mothra to life influenced subsequent productions throughout the kaiju genre, with innovations in puppetry, wirework, and composite photography, finding applications in projects that might not have shared the specific thematic concerns of Kaneko's vision, but benefited from the technical advances that had been necessitated by the challenges of creating convincing supernatural phenomena through practical means. The precedents established by this production demonstrated that traditional effects methods remained capable of achieving results that could compete with digital alternatives when applied with sufficient creativity and technical expertise. 2 years later, the release of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and its sequel, Godzilla Tokyo SOS, would provide opportunities for exploring different aspects of Mothra's mythology within continuities that connected more directly to the classical Golden Age films while incorporating contemporary production values and thematic sensibilities that reflected the accumulated weight of decades of cultural change and technological advancement since the original monster movies had established their enduring appeal to audiences seeking both entertainment and meaning. Tokyo SOS in particular demonstrated how classical mythology could be revitalized through careful attention to continuity with beloved earlier films while addressing contemporary concerns about environmental protection, technological responsibility, and intergenerational justice that had become increasingly urgent as the consequences of industrial civilization's impact on global ecosystems had become impossible to ignore or deny. The film's treatment of Mothra as a force of natural justice who demanded accountability for past actions, while offering possibilities for redemption through genuine change, provided frameworks for thinking about environmental and social problems that required both acknowledgement of damage already done and commitment to preventing further harm. The technical achievements of Tokyo SOS represented the culmination of decades of refinement in practical effects techniques, with Mothra sequences that achieved unprecedented levels of realism and emotional impact through the integration of advanced puppetry, with sophisticated compositing methods that had been developed and perfected through years of experimentation and innovation. The flight sequences in particular demonstrated how traditional wire work could be enhanced through digital removal of support systems and environmental integration that created seamless illusions of creatures whose size and capabilities exceeded anything that purely practical methods could accomplish independently. The characterization of Mothra within this production emphasized her role as a voice of conscience for humanity, with her communications through the Shobijin serving not merely as plot exposition, but as moral guidance that challenged human characters and audiences to consider the ethical implications of technological choices that had previously been evaluated solely in terms of their effectiveness for achieving immediate objectives. Her warnings about the consequences of creating artificial monsters to fight natural ones provided commentary on broader patterns of problem-solving that attempted to address symptoms rather than underlying causes, often creating new difficulties that exceeded the original challenges they had been designed to resolve. The visual spectacle of Mothra's appearances in these Millennium-era productions achieved levels of beauty and majesty that satisfied audiences who had been raised on increasingly sophisticated special effects while maintaining the essential qualities that had made the original character memorable and emotionally engaging across multiple decades and cultural contexts. The balance between technological innovation and respect for traditional design principles demonstrated how classical characters could be updated for contemporary audiences without losing the essential characteristics that had made them beloved cultural icons. The environmental themes that permeated these productions reflected growing international awareness of ecological crises that required immediate attention and long-term commitment to sustainable practices, with Mothra's role as protector of natural harmony providing symbolic representation of values and priorities that were increasingly recognized as essential for human survival in a world where technological capabilities had begun to exceed wisdom about their appropriate applications. The integration of these themes into spectacular entertainment demonstrated how popular culture could contribute to public education about environmental issues without sacrificing the entertainment value that made such messages accessible to broad audiences. The international distribution of these films provided audiences worldwide with exposure to Japanese perspectives on environmental and spiritual questions that might otherwise have remained limited to domestic contexts, contributing to global conversations about sustainability, technological responsibility, and cultural preservation that transcended national boundaries while respecting local traditions and values that gave such discussions their particular significance within specific communities and regions. The influence of these millennium-era Mothra films extended far beyond their immediate commercial and critical success to encompass broader trends in how environmental themes were incorporated into popular entertainment, establishing precedents for approaches that balanced spectacular visual elements with serious treatment of ecological and social concerns that affected audiences in their daily lives, rather than merely providing escapist fantasies that ignored contemporary problems and challenges. The technical innovations pioneered in these productions found applications in subsequent monster movies and other types of fantasy cinema that required the creation of creatures whose behavior and appearance exceeded anything that existed in the natural world, with advances in puppetry, compositing, and digital enhancement techniques becoming standard tools for effects. Artists working on projects that might have different thematic concerns, but shared the challenge of creating convincing illusions of impossible beings and phenomena. The educational value of these films, as documents of advanced practical effects techniques, provided resources for students and professionals seeking to understand how complex visual illusions could be created through the integration of traditional craftsmanship with emerging digital tools, demonstrating approaches to problem solving that emphasized creativity and technical expertise over reliance on expensive equipment or software that might become obsolete as technology continued to evolve at unprecedented rates. The cultural impact of these sophisticated treatments of Mothra mythology contributed to broader recognition of kaiju films as legitimate artistic expressions rather than merely juvenile entertainment, with critical appreciation for the technical craftsmanship and thematic depth that characterized the best examples of the genre, leading to increased academic study and preservation efforts that ensured future generations would have access to these works as both entertainment and historical documents of particular periods in the development of cinema as an art form. The spiritual themes that had been elevated to unprecedented prominence in these millennium productions provided frameworks for understanding how traditional religious and philosophical concepts could be explored through contemporary media, without requiring literal belief in supernatural phenomena, demonstrating how mythological narratives could serve educational and inspirational functions for audiences whose worldviews had been shaped by scientific understanding rather than traditional religious instruction. As the first decade of the 21st century drew toward its close, these achievements in both technical craftsmanship and thematic sophistication had established foundations for even more ambitious projects that would push the boundaries of what kaiju cinema could accomplish in terms of both spectacular, visual entertainment and meaningful exploration of contemporary concerns about humanity's relationship with technological power and environmental responsibility. In the second decade of the 21st century, when digital technologies had begun to reshape every aspect of human civilization, and global environmental crises demanded responses that transcended the capabilities of individual nations or corporations. The ancient art of bringing giant monsters to life, through the marriage of practical craftsmanship and cinematic storytelling, found itself transformed by possibilities that previous generations of filmmakers could never have imagined yet, remained grounded in the same fundamental principles of respect for natural forces and concern for humanity's spiritual relationship with powers greater than themselves. The emergence of Legendary Pictures' Monsterverse represented both culmination and revolution in how these timeless themes could be explored through contemporary production methods, with resources and technological capabilities that exceeded anything available during the golden age of kaiju cinema, while maintaining reverence for the mythological foundations that had made these creatures meaningful to audiences across multiple generations and diverse cultural contexts. The ambition to create a shared universe of interconnected monster films reflected not merely commercial considerations, but genuine understanding that the relationships between these beings and the human communities they affected operated according to principles that required sustained exploration across multiple narratives rather than simple resolution within single cinematic experiences. Mothra's introduction into this expanded mythological framework, through her appearance in Godzilla King of the Monsters, represented perhaps the most sophisticated attempt ever made to translate the spiritual essence of the divine protector into visual and narrative forms that could speak to global audiences whose cultural backgrounds encompassed traditions very different from those that had originally given birth to her mythology, while simultaneously honoring the fundamental characteristics that had made her beloved by generations of viewers who recognized in her presence something that transcended mere entertainment to approach genuine religious experience. The archaeological approach that provided the foundation for understanding Mothra within the Monsterverse continuity reflected contemporary recognition that indigenous wisdom about relationships with natural forces contained insights that modern scientific methods were only beginning to rediscover through disciplines that had learned to integrate empirical observation with respectful acknowledgement of traditional knowledge systems that had sustained human communities for thousands of years before industrial civilization had begun, systematically replacing such understanding with technological solutions that often created more problems than they solved. The discovery of Mothra's temple complex within the Yunnan rainforest of China represented one of the most spectacular achievements in production design that the monster genre had ever witnessed, with architectural and artistic elements that suggested civilizations whose understanding of harmony between built environments and natural ecosystems had achieved levels of sophistication that contemporary urban planning was still struggling to approximate. Despite access to computational tools and environmental sciences that had not been available to ancient builders, who nevertheless created structures that remained functional and beautiful across millennia of climatic and geological change. The monarch organization that served as humanity's primary interface with these rediscovered titans embodied contemporary approaches to scientific research that emphasized international cooperation and interdisciplinary collaboration, while acknowledging that some phenomena required methods of investigation that transcended conventional academic categories, demanding integration of anthropological insights about indigenous cultures with biological studies of ecosystem relationships and geological surveys of environmental conditions that had remained stable across timescales that dwarfed recorded human history. Dr. Emma Russell's breakthrough in establishing communication protocols with titangent-scale lifeforms represented both scientific triumph and personal tragedy, as her success in decoding the acoustic signatures that enabled meaningful dialogue with beings whose intelligence operated according to principles very different from human cognition, came at costs that included the loss of family, relationships, and professional standing that had previously defined her identity and provided meaning for her research efforts that had consumed decades of dedicated work, without producing results that skeptical colleagues and funding agencies had been willing to recognize as legitimate scientific achievement. The Orca device that emerged from Dr. Russell's research embodied both the promise and the peril of technological solutions to communication problems that had previously seemed insoluble, with capabilities that could indeed facilitate understanding between species separated by millions of years of evolutionary development, while simultaneously creating possibilities for exploitation and manipulation that could transform tools designed for peaceful purposes into weapons whose destructive potential exceeded anything that conventional military technology had achieved through purely physical means of inflicting damage upon enemy populations and infrastructure. The larval form of Mothra that was discovered within the temple complex represented a masterpiece of contemporary creature design that utilized the most advanced techniques available in both practical effects, construction, and computer-generated enhancement to create a being whose presence on screen carried both the tactile authenticity that audiences craved from physical constructions and the seamless integration with photographic environments that digital technologies had made possible when applied with sufficient artistry and technical expertise to avoid the artificial appearance that characterized less skillful attempts at creating convincing fantasy creatures. The relationship that developed between Dr. Russell and the larval Mothra during the research period that preceded the global Titan crisis demonstrated how genuine scientific curiosity, combined with respectful acknowledgement of non-human intelligence, could indeed lead to communication across species, boundaries that had previously been considered insurmountable, with interactions that revealed emotional and intellectual capabilities in creatures whose size and alien nature might otherwise have prevented recognition of their capacity for individual personality and social relationships that paralleled human patterns while remaining distinctly non-human in their specific manifestations. The metamorphosis sequence that transformed the larval Mothra into her adult form represented perhaps the most spectacular achievement in monster movie history, combining practical effects, elements, with digital enhancement techniques to create imagery that captured both the biological reality of insect development and the spiritual significance of transformation as metaphor for growth and renewal that could inspire audiences struggling with their own processes of change and adaptation to circumstances that demanded evolution beyond familiar patterns of thought and behavior. The adult Mothra that emerged from this transformation embodied visual magnificence that exceeded anything previously achieved in kaiju cinema, with wing patterns and bioluminescent features that created the impression of a creature whose beauty transcended ordinary natural phenomena while maintaining biological plausibility that grounded her supernatural qualities in recognizable flaws. Evolutionary processes that audiences could accept as extensions of familiar principles, rather than arbitrary magical phenomena that had no connection to observed reality. The Queen of the Monsters title that Mothra claimed within the Titan hierarchy reflected both her traditional role as divine protector and contemporary understanding of alpha-predator relationships that had been revealed through decades of wildlife research, demonstrating how certain species served as keystone elements within ecological systems, with their presence or absence affecting the behavior and population dynamics of numerous other species in ways that rippled through entire environmental networks. according to principles that scientists were still working to understand completely. The acoustic signature that served as Mothra's distinctive call incorporated both traditional elements from her classic song and contemporary sound design techniques that could create audio experiences of unprecedented richness and emotional impact, with harmonic structures that spoke to audiences on levels that bypassed conscious analysis to produce visceral responses that confirmed her status as a being whose nature transcended ordinary categorization and demanded recognition as something approaching the divine. The territorial conflicts that brought Mothra into contact with other titans revealed aspects of monster psychology that had never before been explored with such depth and nuance as her interactions with Rodan, King Ghidorah, and Godzilla himself demonstrated that these beings possessed complex social hierarchies and alliance patterns that influenced their behavior in ways that paralleled human political dynamics while remaining grounded in instinctual imperatives that had been shaped by millions of years of evolutionary competition for resources and reproductive opportunities. The Boston battle that served as the climactic confrontation of King of the Monsters showcased Mothra's combat capabilities within contexts that emphasized both her individual power and her role as part of a team whose success depended upon coordination and mutual support rather than simple dominance through superior force, demonstrating that even the most spectacular action sequences could serve thematic purposes that elevated physical conflict into expressions of deeper philosophical and spiritual concepts about cooperation and sacrifice. The alliance between Mothra and Godzilla that formed the emotional center of this climactic battle represented one of the most sophisticated explorations of interspecies relationships that popular cinema had ever attempted, with their cooperation demonstrating how beings whose natures seemed fundamentally incompatible could indeed find common ground when faced with threats that endangered the stability of systems that supported all life rather than merely their own individual survival or territorial ambitions. The sacrifice that concluded Mothra's participation in this cosmic struggle maintained continuity with her traditional role as maternal protector, while adapting the themes of death and renewal to contemporary contexts where individual heroism might be less significant than collective action, that required multiple participants making complementary contributions, rather than single individuals providing decisive interventions that resolved complex problems through purely personal effort and determination. The visual poetry of Mothra's death sequence, with her essence transforming into energy that enhanced Godzilla's capabilities for the final confrontation with King Ghidorah, created imagery that spoke to universal human experiences of love, transcending physical limitations, while remaining specific to the mythological frameworks that gave these particular characters their distinctive meanings and emotional resonance for audiences who had followed their stories across multiple decades and cultural transformations. The resurrection themes that were established through the appearance of a single egg in the closing moments of the film maintained hope for future appearances, while acknowledging that renewal often required patience and faith that essential values would eventually find new expressions, even when their familiar forms had been lost to circumstances that demanded sacrifice of individual existence for the preservation of principles and relationships that transcended any single lifetime or manifestation. The global scale of destruction and restoration that characterized these monsterverse productions reflected contemporary awareness that environmental and spiritual crises had reached dimensions that required responses from entire planetary communities rather than individual nations or organizations, with monster battles serving as metaphors for challenges that could only be addressed through unprecedented levels of international cooperation and shared commitment to values that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term advantages. The scientific frameworks that provided context for understanding Titan behavior incorporated insights from multiple disciplines, ranging from evolutionary biology to quantum physics to consciousness studies, demonstrating how contemporary knowledge could enhance rather than replace traditional wisdom about relationships between different forms of intelligence and awareness that operated according to principles that purely materialistic approaches to understanding consciousness had proven inadequate to explain or predict. The visual spectacle achieved through combination of practical construction and digital enhancement techniques created experiences that satisfied contemporary audiences' expectations for photorealistic fantasy while maintaining the essential qualities that had made earlier monster movies emotionally engaging, demonstrating that technological advancement could serve artistic vision when applied with sufficient understanding of what made these characters meaningful to viewers seeking both entertainment and spiritual nourishment. The cultural impact of these productions extended far beyond their immediate commercial success to influence broader conversations about environmental responsibility, international cooperation, and the relationship between technological capabilities and wisdom about their appropriate applications, with Mothra's role as divine protector providing symbolic representation of values that were increasingly recognized as essential for human survival in an interconnected world where individual actions could have consequences that affected communities and ecosystems far removed from their immediate contexts. The educational value of these films as demonstrations of how traditional mythological themes could be explored through contemporary media provided frameworks for understanding how ancient wisdom could remain relevant to modern challenges when interpreted through approaches that respected both the original cultural contexts that had given birth to such stories and the changed circumstances that required adaptation of their specific applications, while preserving their essential insights about relationships between humanity and forces greater than themselves. The international distribution of these productions provided audiences worldwide with shared experiences of wonder and terror that transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries, while respecting the particular traditions that had originally given birth to these characters, demonstrating how global entertainment could contribute to mutual understanding and appreciation rather than cultural homogenization that eliminated local differences in favor of simplified universal themes that lacked the depth and specificity that made traditional stories meaningful to the viewer, communities that had preserved them across generations. The technical achievements that made these spectacular productions possible established new standards for what could be accomplished through careful integration of practical and digital techniques, providing resources and inspiration for future filmmakers seeking to create their own interpretations of mythological themes that required visual realization of phenomena that exceeded anything available in ordinary experience, while remaining grounded in recognizable principles that audiences could accept as extensions of familiar reality. The spiritual dimensions of these contemporary treatments of ancient themes provided opportunities for audiences to engage with questions about meaning and purpose that might otherwise have remained abstract philosophical concepts, using the emotional impact of spectacular entertainment to create openings for contemplation of deeper issues about individual responsibility, community relationships, and humanity's place within cosmic systems whose scope and complexity exceeded what any single perspective could encompass completely. As the monsterverse continued to evolve through subsequent productions that would explore different aspects of Titan mythology and human relationships with forces beyond their control, the precedents established by Mothra's introduction into this expanded narrative framework would continue to influence how these themes were developed and expressed, ensuring that future explorations of such material would maintain both respect for traditional wisdom and commitment to addressing contemporary concerns through approaches that honored both continuity and change. Across the span of more than 6 decades, from the first whispered rumors of luminous fairies dwelling on remote Pacific islands to the spectacular digital resurrections that grace 21st century cinema screens, the enduring appeal of Mothra as cultural icon and spiritual symbol has transcended the boundaries of entertainment to become a repository for humanity's deepest hopes and fears about their relationship with the natural world and the consequences of choices that prioritize immediate convenience over long-term wisdom about sustainable coexistence with forces greater than individual human ambition or corporate profit margins. The environmental themes that have formed the philosophical foundation of virtually every Mothra story reflect the evolution of ecological consciousness, from the relatively simple conservation concerns of the 1960s to the complex global climate challenges that define contemporary discussions about humanity's responsibility to future generations and non-human species whose survival depends upon decisions made by political and economic institutions that have historically prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability and intergenerational justice. The consistency with which these environmental messages have been woven into narratives spanning multiple decades and diverse creative teams demonstrates that the connection between Mothra's mythology and ecological protection represents more than superficial thematic decoration applied to monster movie formulas designed primarily for spectacular entertainment value. Instead, these themes emerge from fundamental recognition that the spiritual dimensions of human experience cannot be separated from material relationships with physical environments that sustain all life, requiring approaches to storytelling that integrate action sequences with philosophical content in ways that enhance rather than compromise either element. The maternal protection instincts that define Mothra's essential character have provided frameworks for exploring how individual sacrifice can serve collective welfare, while simultaneously examining the psychological and spiritual costs that such dedication requires from those who assume responsibility for defending communities against threats that exceed the capacity of ordinary citizens to address through conventional political or economic mechanisms. Her willingness to die for the protection of others, demonstrated repeatedly across multiple incarnations and interpretations, speaks to universal human experiences of parental love, while extending such feelings beyond biological relationships to encompass broader concepts of community membership and species solidarity. The recurring cycles of death and rebirth that characterize Mothra's appearances across different film series reflect both biological reality of insect metamorphosis and spiritual traditions that recognize transformation as essential aspect of growth and renewal that requires letting go of familiar identities and behaviors that have outlived their usefulness in favor of evolved forms that can address challenges and opportunities that previous versions could not handle adequately. These resurrection themes provide hope for audiences struggling with personal or collective problems that seem insurmountable within existing frameworks, while acknowledging that meaningful change often requires sacrifices that may not be immediately rewarded or even recognized by beneficiaries. The divine feminine archetype that Mothra embodies within Kaiju mythology represents conscious counterbalance to predominantly masculine energy that characterizes most giant monster cinema, providing representation for nurturing and protective qualities that complement rather than compete with more aggressive approaches to problem solving, while demonstrating that strength manifested through compassion and wisdom can prove more effective than purely physical power when addressing conflicts that have roots in misunderstanding or spiritual disconnection, rather than simple competition for material resources. The relationship between Eastern and Western cultural perspectives that has been explored through various international co-productions and adaptations featuring Mothra reflects broader questions about how traditional wisdom can be preserved and transmitted across cultural boundaries without losing essential meaning through translation processes that may emphasize superficial, exotic elements while missing deeper philosophical content that gives such traditions their enduring relevance for contemporary challenges that transcend national or ethnic categories yet require understanding of specific cultural contexts to address effectively. The exploitation themes that appear consistently throughout Mothra stories, from the original corporate villains who sought to profit from exhibitions of divine power, to contemporary narratives about genetic manipulation and environmental destruction driven by short-term financial considerations, provide frameworks for analyzing how economic systems that prioritize immediate returns over long-term sustainability inevitably create conflicts between human communities and natural forces that have evolved over millions of years. According to principles that cannot be safely ignored or overruled through technological interventions that fail to account for ecological relationships and spiritual dimensions of existence. The nuclear age anxieties that provided historical context for the original kaiju genre continue to find expression through Mothra stories that address contemporary concerns about technological capabilities that exceed human wisdom about their appropriate applications, with atomic weapons serving as symbols for broader patterns of scientific and industrial development that create problems requiring responses that transcend the expertise of any single discipline or the authority of individual institutions, demanding cooperation between communities that may have competing interests, but share vulnerability to consequences that recognize no political or cultural boundaries. The role of music and song as means of communication between human and non-human intelligence has remained constant throughout Mothra's cinematic history, reflecting recognition that some forms of understanding transcend verbal language and logical analysis to operate through emotional and spiritual channels that can bridge differences in cognitive structure and sensory capability, while creating shared experiences that provide foundations for cooperation between beings whose natural perspectives and priorities might otherwise prevent mutual recognition and respect. The integration of ancient wisdom with contemporary scientific understanding that characterizes the most sophisticated Mothra stories demonstrates how traditional knowledge systems can complement rather than compete with modern research methods when both approaches are applied with appropriate humility and recognition that complex problems require multiple perspectives and methodologies to address adequately, with indigenous insights about ecological relationships proving particularly valuable for understanding how human activities affect environmental systems in ways that purely technological approaches to problem solving often fail to, one, anticipate or account for properly. The international cooperation themes that have become increasingly prominent in later Mothra films reflect growing recognition that environmental challenges and spiritual crises operate on scales that exceed the capacity of individual nations or organizations to address effectively, requiring unprecedented levels of coordination between communities whose historical relationships may have been characterized by competition or conflict, but who must learn to collaborate when faced with threats that endanger their shared planetary home and the ecological systems that support all life, regardless of political affiliations or cultural identities. The portrayal of corporate interests as primary antagonists throughout most Mothra narratives provides critical commentary on economic systems that treat natural resources and living beings as commodities to be exploited rather than treasures to be preserved, with business villains representing institutional rather than merely individual forms of moral corruption that operate according to structural incentives that reward short-term profit maximization while externalizing costs onto communities and ecosystems that lack political power to protect themselves from such exploitation through conventional legal or regulatory mechanisms. The scientific wonder that accompanies virtually every encounter with Mothra reflects genuine appreciation for natural phenomena that exceed human understanding, while remaining grounded in recognizable biological principles, creating experiences of awe that can inspire audiences to develop deeper respect for ecological relationships and evolutionary processes that have produced forms of intelligence and beauty that transcend anything that human creativity could design or construct through purely artificial means, regardless of technological sophistication or artistic ambition. The children and young people who frequently serve as protagonists in Mothra stories represent hope for future generations, while acknowledging that environmental and spiritual challenges require perspectives that have not been corrupted by participation in systems that created the problems, requiring solution, with youthful characters, demonstrating forms of moral clarity and emotional openness that adults may have lost through accommodation to social and economic pressures that prioritize conformity and immediate survival over principled commitment to values that serve long-term welfare of entire communities. The government bureaucracy that appears in most Mothra films typically represents institutional inertia and resistance to change rather than evil intent, providing realistic portrayal of how democratic systems can become obstacles to necessary action when problems require responses that exceed existing administrative categories or challenge powerful interests that benefit from maintaining current policies and procedures, even when evidence clearly demonstrates that such approaches have become inadequate or counterproductive for addressing evolving circumstances. The religious and spiritual dimensions that permeate Mothra mythology acknowledge that environmental protection and social justice cannot be sustained through purely rational arguments or technological solutions alone, but require emotional and spiritual commitments that connect individual actions to larger meanings and purposes that transcend immediate self-interest, with reverence for natural beauty and divine mystery, providing motivational foundations that can sustain long-term dedication to causes that may not produce visible results within individual lifetimes. The artistic collaborations between human creative communities and supernatural forces that are depicted in several Mothra stories suggest possibilities for forms of cultural expression that integrate human imagination with non-human perspectives and capabilities, creating works that expand understanding of beauty and meaning beyond what either species could achieve independently, while demonstrating that cooperation across species boundaries can produce results that benefit all participants rather than requiring zero-sum competition for limited resources or recognition. The healing sequences that appear frequently in contemporary Mothra films provide images of environmental restoration and personal recovery that demonstrate how patient, careful work can indeed reverse damage that initially appears irreversible, offering hope for communities and ecosystems that have suffered harm while acknowledging that genuine healing requires addressing underlying causes rather than merely treating visible symptoms, with recovery processes that may take generations to complete, but can achieve results that justify sustained effort and sacrifice. The legacy themes that connect individual Mothra films to broader cultural traditions and ongoing environmental movements demonstrate how popular entertainment can serve educational and inspirational functions that extend far beyond immediate commercial objectives, with stories that preserve important values and insights across generational transitions while adapting their specific expressions to address changing circumstances and emerging challenges that require fresh approaches informed by accumulated wisdom from past experience. The visual spectacle that characterizes the most successful Mothra productions creates experiences that satisfy contemporary audiences' expectations for sophisticated entertainment while delivering meaningful content about pathia, relationships between humanity and natural forces that require respectful acknowledgement rather than attempted domination, demonstrating that spectacular action sequences can serve philosophical purposes when choreographed and presented with sufficient artistry and thematic coherence to transform mere excitement into genuine inspiration. The educational value that emerges from serious engagement with Mothra mythology provides frameworks for understanding complex ecological and spiritual concepts that might otherwise remain abstract theoretical knowledge without practical application, with dramatic narratives that make such ideas accessible to broad audiences while maintaining sufficient depth and nuance to reward careful study and reflection by viewers seeking deeper understanding of issues that affect their daily lives and long-term prospects for achieving sustainable relationships with their environments. The psychological healing that many viewers report experiencing through encounters with Mothra stories suggests that these narratives serve therapeutic functions that address spiritual and emotional needs that are often neglected by contemporary culture's emphasis on technological solutions and material achievements, providing opportunities for contemplation of meaning and purpose that can help individuals develop more balanced perspectives on their place within larger systems of mutual interdependence and shared responsibility. The influence on subsequent creature features and environmental narratives that can be traced to Mothra's pioneering exploration of themes connecting monster movies to ecological consciousness has extended far beyond the kaiju genre to encompass broader trends in how popular culture addresses relationships between humanity and nature, establishing precedents for approaches that balance entertainment value with serious treatment of environmental and spiritual concerns that affect audiences in their roles as citizens and community members. The preservation efforts that have maintained access to classic Mothra films while supporting continued production of new interpretations demonstrate recognition that these stories represent cultural treasures whose value extends beyond immediate commercial considerations to encompass their contributions to ongoing conversations about humanity's relationship with forces greater than themselves, ensuring that future generations will have opportunities to benefit from wisdom that has been accumulated through decades of creative exploration of themes that remain relevant despite changing technological and social circumstances. Throughout the decades that have witnessed the evolution of Mothra, from regional Japanese cultural phenomenon to global symbol of environmental protection and spiritual transformation, perhaps no single element of her mythology has demonstrated such remarkable persistence and adaptability as the sacred song that serves as both her identifying signature and the primary means through which human communities have maintained communication with divine forces that transcend ordinary, understanding and conventional approaches to problem solving that rely solely upon technological solutions or political negotiations between competing interests. The original composition created by Yuji Koseki for the 1961 Mothra film established musical and linguistic foundations that would prove sufficiently flexible to accommodate countless reinterpretations and variations, while maintaining essential harmonic and rhythmic characteristics that continue to evoke the same emotional responses and spiritual associations across multiple generations of listeners whose cultural backgrounds and personal experiences differed dramatically from those of the Japanese audiences who first encountered these melodies in darkened theaters where the boundaries between entertainment and religious experience dissolved beneath the weight of genuine wonder and terror. The decision to construct the song using Indonesian linguistic elements adapted for Japanese pronunciation reflected the internationalist vision that had guided the creation of infant island mythology, with its emphasis on cultural synthesis and mutual understanding between communities whose geographical separation and historical development had created different approaches to addressing universal human needs for meaning, beauty, and connection to forces greater than individual survival instincts or material accumulation, while simultaneously acknowledging that such differences could enrich rather than threaten collaborative efforts to address shared challenges. The harmonic structures that Koseki embedded within these seemingly simple melodies incorporated sophisticated musical relationships that operated simultaneously on conscious and unconscious levels of perception, creating compositions that could satisfy trained musicians seeking intellectual complexity while remaining accessible to untrained listeners whose emotional responses to rhythm and melody provided more direct pathways to the spiritual experiences that the songs were designed to facilitate through their integration of human vocal capabilities with supernatural themes that transcended ordinary entertainment categories. The collaborative process that brought the Peanuts musical duo into the creative development of these songs demonstrated how individual artistic talents could be enhanced rather than constrained by incorporation into larger projects that required subordination of personal expression to collective objectives, with Emi and Yumi Ito contributing vocal techniques and interpretive insights that elevated Koseki's compositions beyond their original conception to achieve levels of beauty and emotional impact that neither the composer nor the performers could have accomplished through purely independent, creative work. The recording techniques that were developed to capture and preserve these performances reflected the technological capabilities available during the early 1960s, while pushing those limitations to achieve results that would remain satisfactory to audiences whose listening experiences had been shaped by subsequent advances in audio reproduction quality and studio production methods, with engineering solutions that maximize the emotional impact of relatively simple recording setups through careful attention to microphone placement, acoustic environments, and mixing approaches that emphasize clarity and presence over sophisticated effects processing. The integration of these songs into the dramatic narratives of multiple films required delicate balance between their function as plot devices that could advance story development and their independent artistic value as musical compositions that deserved appreciation for their intrinsic beauty and spiritual significance, with directors and editors learning to create cinematic context that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the song's essential qualities, while ensuring that their appearances served narrative purposes beyond mere exotic decoration or nostalgic reference to earlier productions. The international distribution of films containing these songs provided global audiences with exposure to musical forms and linguistic elements that might otherwise have remained limited to Japanese cultural contexts, contributing to broader appreciation for artistic traditions that operated according to aesthetic principles, different from those that dominated Western popular music, while demonstrating that emotional and spiritual content could transcend cultural boundaries when expressed through sufficiently universal themes and skillful artistic execution. The cover versions and tribute performances that began appearing within years of the original recordings reflected both commercial recognition of the song's popular appeal and genuine artistic admiration for compositions whose unusual structure and thematic content challenged conventional approaches to melody, harmony, and vocal performance while providing opportunities for musicians from different cultural backgrounds to explore how these elements might be adapted to serve their own creative objectives and audience expectations. The orchestral arrangements that were developed for concert presentations and special events demonstrated how the relatively simple original compositions could be expanded and elaborated without losing their essential character or emotional impact, with symphonic treatments that revealed harmonic and rhythmic complexities that had been present but less obvious in the original recordings, while creating performance opportunities for musicians whose training and experience had prepared them to work within classical rather than popular music traditions. The use of Mothra songs in advertising campaigns and commercial applications reflected both their recognition value among consumers and their association with concepts of purity, protection, and environmental harmony that made them appropriate accompaniments for products and services that sought to position themselves as beneficial rather than exploitative in their relationships with natural resources and consumer welfare. Though such commercial applications also raised questions about the appropriateness of using sacred music for profit-generating activities that might conflict with the spiritual values that the songs were originally intended to express and preserve. The psychological research that has been conducted into the effects of these melodies on listener mood, stress levels, and cognitive performance has revealed measurable impacts that support anecdotal reports of their calming and restorative properties, with studies documenting changes in brainwave patterns, heart rate variability, and hormonal responses that suggest these compositions activate physiological mechanisms associated with relaxation, healing, and enhanced emotional regulation through pathways that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness and voluntary control. The therapeutic applications that have been developed based on these research findings include their integration into meditation practices, sleep enhancement programs, anxiety reduction treatments, and pain management protocols that utilize the song's documented ability to influence autonomic nervous system functioning in ways that promote healing and emotional balance without requiring pharmaceutical interventions or complex medical procedures, though such applications must be approached with appropriate recognition of individual differences in response to musical stimuli and cultural associations that may influence effectiveness. The linguistic analysis that has been conducted on the song texts has revealed layers of meaning that extend beyond their surface function as melodic vehicles to encompass symbolic and metaphorical content that connects to broader themes within Japanese and Indonesian cultural traditions, with phonetic elements that carry emotional and spiritual associations independent of their literal semantic content, while creating sound patterns that interact with musical rhythms to produce effects that transcend what either linguistic or musical elements could achieve independently. The pedagogical uses that have been developed for these songs include their incorporation into language learning curricula that use their familiar melodies as vehicles for teaching pronunciation and vocabulary acquisition, music education programs that analyze their harmonic structures and cultural contexts to illustrate principles of composition and cross-cultural artistic exchange, and environmental education initiatives that use their thematic content to introduce concepts about ecological relationships and human responsibilities for environmental protection and species preservation. The digital preservation efforts that have been undertaken to ensure continued access to original recordings and their associated visual presentations reflect recognition that these songs represent cultural artifacts whose historical and artistic significance extends beyond their immediate entertainment value to encompass their contributions to international understanding and appreciation for Japanese artistic traditions. With restoration projects that utilize advanced audio and video technologies to enhance quality while maintaining fidelity to the original artistic intentions and production circumstances. The fan communities that have formed around appreciation and preservation of Mothra song traditions demonstrate how popular culture can create social networks that transcend geographical boundaries and language differences, with online forums, performance groups, and cultural events that bring together individuals whose shared enthusiasm for these compositions provides foundations for friendships and collaborative projects that extend far beyond their original musical interests to encompass broader cultural exchange and mutual support activities. The academic study that has been devoted to these songs within university courses, focused on film music, ethnomusicology, and popular culture studies, reflects their recognition as legitimate subjects for scholarly investigation rather than merely commercial entertainment products. With research projects that examine their historical development, cultural significance, and influence on subsequent musical compositions, while providing students with opportunities to develop analytical skills and cultural awareness through engagement with materials that combine artistic merit with accessibility to diverse audiences. The live performance traditions that have been established through concert presentations, festival appearances, and tribute shows demonstrate how these songs continue to find new audiences and performance contexts decades after their original creation, with musicians and vocalists who bring their own interpretive insights to compositions whose flexibility allows for considerable variation in style and presentation, while maintaining the essential characteristics that make them recognizable and emotionally effective for audiences familiar with their cinematic origins. The technological innovations that have been developed to support performance and distribution of these songs include digital instruments that can reproduce traditional Japanese and Indonesian musical elements, vocal processing systems that enable single performers to create multi-part harmonies, and mobile applications that provide interactive experiences, combining the songs with visual elements and educational content that enhances appreciation for their cultural contexts and artistic achievements. The intergenerational transmission of appreciation for these songs occurs through family viewing experiences, educational programs, and cultural events that introduce younger audiences to compositions that might otherwise be dismissed as outdated entertainment artifacts. With parents and teachers who recognize the song's continuing relevance for addressing contemporary concerns about environmental protection, international cooperation, and spiritual values that transcend material accumulation and competitive success in purely economic terms. The cross-cultural adaptations that have emerged through collaboration between Japanese and international artists demonstrate how these songs can serve as vehicles for exploring universal themes while respecting the specific cultural traditions that gave them birth. With fusion performances and recording projects that combine traditional elements with contemporary musical styles and technologies to create works that speak to diverse audiences while maintaining connection to their historical and spiritual foundations. The influence on contemporary popular music that can be traced to these pioneering compositions includes their impact on ambient music, world music fusion, and electronic compositions that incorporate non-Western musical elements, with artists who cite Mothra songs as inspirations for their own work, while adapting their harmonic and rhythmic characteristics to serve different artistic objectives and address current social and environmental concerns through musical means that combine entertainment value with meaningful cultural content. The memorial and commemorative uses that have been developed for these songs include their performance at environmental events, peace ceremonies, and cultural celebrations that honor the memory of individuals who devoted their lives to causes represented by Mothra mythology, with musical tributes that connect personal loss and community grief to larger themes about continuity, renewal, and the persistence of values that transcend individual mortality to influence future generations. The research into the neurological mechanisms through which these songs produce their documented effects on human consciousness and behavior continues to reveal new insights into how music can influence brain function, emotional regulation, and social bonding, with studies that utilize advanced imaging technologies and measurement techniques to understand how specific musical elements interact with cognitive and physiological processes to create experiences that participants describe as transcendent, healing, or spiritually meaningful. As our journey through the luminous chronicles of Mothra draws to its gentle close, we find ourselves returned to the beginning of all stories, where creation and destruction dance their eternal waltz across the stage of time itself. From the volcanic birth of Infant Island to the neon-bright towers of modern cities, Mothra's wings have carried the hopes and dreams of those who believe that even in the darkest hours, divine protection watches over the innocent and the faithful. Her song echoes still in the deep places of memory, where ancient melodies speak of bonds that transcend species and understanding that surpasses human wisdom. In every chrysalis that splits to reveal transformed beauty, in every larva that struggles toward its magnificent destiny, in every note of music that soothes the troubled spirit, Mothra's presence continues to bless our world with the promise that love is indeed the greatest force in all creation. Rest now in the knowledge that somewhere beyond the reach of corporate ambition and nuclear terror, divine wings spread wide to shelter dreams and protect the tomorrow that awaits beyond the horizon of sleep. Let the sacred songs carry you gently into slumber's embrace,